Alice Miller spent her career revealing a simple but often frightening truth. The child we once were continues to shape the adult we become. In this episode, we explore how early emotional patterns influence our choices, reactions, and relationships quietly and powerfully. If you've ever wondered why certain fears, habits, or longings feel so familiar, this reflection will help you understand the echoes beneath them and how compassion can begin to soften their hold. There comes a moment in nearly every adult life when we recognize that our reactions do not match the situation in front of us. We withdraw too quickly or cling too tightly. We explode when we wish we could stay calm, or we stay silent when we desperately want to speak. These moments are not signs of failure, they're signs of history. They reveal that inside each of us lives a younger self, one who learned how to survive long before we had the words to explain why those strategies mattered. This episode explores that younger self, the emotional child, who still shapes our adult decisions. The psychologist and writer Alice Miller devoted her life to uncovering this connection. She believed that to understand our present, we must be willing to look gently at the past, not to blame anyone, but to acknowledge the emotional truth we once had no power to articulate. In her seminal work, The Drama of the Gifted Child, she wrote, "The true drama is that the child must accommodate to the parent's needs and lose her own truth in the process." This is not an accusation, it is a description of how children survive. A child cannot judge the emotional environment they are given. They cannot say, "My parent is overwhelmed," or "My feelings aren't being understood." A child simply adapts. If love is given only when they are quiet, they learn to silence themselves. If love depends on achievement, they learn to overperform. If love disappears during conflict, they learn to avoid disagreement at all costs. These adjustments, once necessary, become invisible templates for adulthood. What we call personality is often a set of strategies invented by a child who did not want to lose connection. Miller believed that these strategies remain inside us, shaping our adult choices long after we forget their origins. Understanding them is not about revisiting pain, it's about reclaiming agency. As we begin this journey, hold one truth close. Nothing about your reactions is random. They come from somewhere, and when we learn to trace them back to their beginning, something softens not through force, but through recognition. This episode is an invitation to that recognition, approached with tenderness, patience, and the compassion that Miller believed every inner child deserves. There's a quiet truth many adults carry, but rarely name. The feeling that something inside us is directing our choices without our permission. We notice it in the patterns we repeat, how we choose partners who feel strangely familiar, how we avoid certain conversations with almost reflexive fear, how we overextend ourselves in relationships or shrink in the presence of strong emotions. These habits appear so consistently that they start to feel like destiny, as if they were written into us rather than learned. But Alice Miller argued that these patterns are not destiny at all. They are echoes of the emotional world we grew up in. This matters deeply because modern adulthood places a heavy burden on self-awareness. We're expected to make thoughtful decisions, communicate clearly, set boundaries, and know our own worth. Yet many of us move through life feeling subtly unprepared, as though everyone else received an invisible manual we somehow missed. We sense that something inside us tightens in predictable ways, but we don't understand why. In our fast-paced world, this tension becomes even sharper. The expectations of work, partnership, and independence are layered on top of childhood strategies that were never revised for adulthood. A child learns to stay quiet to avoid punishment or disappointment, and suddenly a 25-year-old finds themselves unable to speak up in meetings or tell a partner what they truly need. Another child learns that love is conditional dependent on achievement or emotional caretaking, and the adult version works themselves into exhaustion, striving to be indispensable in every space they enter. These patterns are not flaws of character, they are remnants of survival. But because they no longer fit the adult situations we live in, they create friction. We may look successful on the outside, yet inside we carry the uneasy sense that our life is being shaped by forces we don't fully understand. Miller believed that much of adult suffering comes from this mismatch between past and present, the unspoken rulebook of childhood applied to a world where we finally have choices we once lacked. The problem grows heavier when we blame ourselves for these reactions. Instead of seeing them as memories expressed through emotion, we label them as weaknesses. We call ourselves sensitive, we're clingy, cold, conflict avoidant, or too intense, never realizing that these are simply adult words for childhood adaptations. The deeper issue is not that we behave this way, but that we don't understand why we behave this way. Without that understanding, we repeat patterns with a sense of helplessness, believing that we should already know how to be different. Miller invites us to imagine a gentler lens. She suggests that our difficulties are not evidence of personal failure, but evidence of early strategies trying to protect us long after their usefulness has passed. When we see our patterns this way, as echoes rather than defects, we create room for curiosity instead of shame, and that curiosity becomes the first step toward choosing differently. Alice Miller approached the question of childhood influence with a kind of clarity that was both compassionate and uncompromising. She believed that children are exquisitely sensitive to the emotional climate of their home, even when no one speaks directly about feelings. A child grows attuned to facial expressions, tones of voice, silences, and shifts in mood. They learn quickly, sometimes instantly, what brings warmth and what brings distance. And because their survival depends on connection, they adapt. Miller emphasized that these adaptations are not conscious choices, they are automatic emotional responses. A child who senses that their sadness is unwelcome learns to hide it without ever deciding to. A child who feels responsible for a parent's happiness learns to monitor other people's emotions with almost supernatural precision. A child who discovers that love comes after achievement learns to perform, excel, and impress long before they understand the word achievement. These patterns become internal maps, guiding the child through the complex terrain of their family life. But Miller insisted on something crucial. These maps do not stay in childhood. They become internalized and continue guiding us into adulthood, often without our awareness. A pattern that once protected us becomes a default setting. We follow it because it's familiar, not because it's true. And we rarely stop to ask whether the old map still fits the terrain of our current life. Miller wrote a line that captures this dynamic with striking simplicity. What is not felt cannot be healed. She believed that the emotional truth of childhood, especially the pain that had to be hidden, does not vanish with time. It remains stored in the body, waiting for acknowledgement. That pain shows up in adulthood not through memory but through behavior, the fear of disappointing others, the inability to rest, the urge to please, the dread of conflict, the longing for approval, the instinct to withdraw when feeling vulnerable. These reactions are not random, they are expressions of an emotional story that was never allowed to be told. Consider Miller's idea of the adapted child. This is the part of us that learned to be hyper-responsible or invisible or charming or compliant. As adults, these traits may even be praised. Society often rewards the very behaviors that once kept us emotionally safe. The problem is that these adaptations can become prisons. The adult who learned to be responsible for everyone else's feelings may struggle to recognize their own needs. The adult who learned to make themselves small may find it impossible to take up space. The adult who learned to perform for love may never experience love as something freely given. Miller believed that the way out begins with recognition. When we understand that our reactions stem from childhood, we stop blaming ourselves for them. We stop asking, what is wrong with me, and begin asking, where did I learn this? This shift is subtle but profound. It transforms shame into discovery. It lets us approach ourselves with the gentleness a child deserved but may not have received. To Miller, insight was not intellectual, it was emotional. It required feeling the truth of our early experiences, even when those feelings challenge the narratives of a happy childhood that many adults hold on to. She wasn't asking us to reject our families, she was asking us to stop rejecting our own emotional reality. And that, she believed, is where healing begins. Now we turn to what these insights look like in everyday adult life, because childhood echoes rarely appear as memories. They show themselves through reactions that feel automatic, overwhelming, or strangely familiar. When Alice Miller spoke of the adapted child, she wasn't describing a historical version of us, she was describing the part that still steps in whenever we feel threatened, unseen, or emotionally exposed. And because this process happens beneath conscious awareness, we often mistake these reflexes for our personality. Imagine someone who grew up learning that their emotions were inconvenient. Perhaps a parent felt easily overwhelmed, distracted, or dismissive. That child learned to minimize their needs, to be easy, to not ask for much. As an adult, this same person may find it nearly impossible to express discomfort, fear, or sadness. They may stay silent in relationships, keeping their emotional life hidden even when they desperately want connection. They do not think, "I must hide to stay safe." They simply feel a tightening in the chest, a pressure to stay composed, a fear of burdening someone else. This is the child's strategy, still active. Or consider the child who was praised primarily for achievement. They grew up believing their worth depended on performance. Now the adult version is driven, ambitious, and endlessly productive, but underneath lies a quiet terror of slowing down. Rest feels dangerous. Taking a break brings guilt. They choose jobs, relationships, and environments where they can constantly prove themselves, not because they desire recognition, but because recognition once felt like love. The adult rationalizes it as ambition. The child remembers striving to earn affection. Another example, a child who had to manage a parent's emotions, comforting them, absorbing their anxiety, calming outbursts. This child becomes an adult who immediately scans rooms for tension, who assumes responsibility for everyone else's feelings, who apologizes even when they have done nothing wrong. They form relationships where they are the caretaker, the stabilizer, the emotional anchor, and when they feel burnt out, they blame themselves, never realizing that their entire identity is shaped around preventing the emotional chaos they once grew up with. These patterns can also appear in conflicts. A child who learned that disagreement leads to punishment or withdrawal may become an adult who avoids conflict altogether. They say yes when they mean no, or they disappear emotionally when tensions rise, not because they lack courage, but because their body still carries the memory of danger. Conversely, a child who grew up unseen or ignored may become an adult who reacts to conflict with intensity, raising their voice, fighting for acknowledgement, fearing abandonment so deeply that even small disagreements feel catastrophic. In all of these examples, what looks like adult decision-making is often a younger part of us acting out a familiar script. Miller wanted us to understand this, not to feel trapped, but to feel compassionate. When we see the child behind our reactions, we soften. We stop expecting ourselves to effortlessly override instincts that were rooted in survival. We recognize that these emotional reflexes do not mean we are broken. They mean we once adapted brilliantly to circumstances we didn't choose. And crucially, recognizing these patterns allows us to pause. It creates space between the trigger and the reaction. It opens a doorway where something new can enter: awareness, choice, and the possibility of responding from the adult self, rather than the child who once had no other option. There is a quiet moment in healing when understanding becomes more than an idea. It becomes a shift, a soft but unmistakable turning point. This moment isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with revelation or triumph. Instead, it feels like recognition, like finally seeing the outline of something that has been shaping your life from the shadows. Alice Miller believed that this recognition is the beginning of emotional freedom because it rewrites the story we tell ourselves about why we react the way we do. For many people, this shift begins when they realize that their adult patterns make perfect emotional sense once childhood is taken into account. The person who panics at the thought of disappointing others begins to understand that their fear isn't irrational. It's a memory of a time when affection depended on compliance. The person who works themselves to exhaustion begins to see that their drive wasn't born from ambition alone. It was born from a child who equated achievement with love. The person who withdraws during conflict recognizes that they're not being avoidant. They're protecting themselves from the emotional danger they once faced. This reframing is transformative. It doesn't instantly change behavior, but it changes the emotional meaning behind that behavior. Instead of shame, there is curiosity. Instead of frustration, there is gentleness. Instead of thinking, "Why am I like this?" the question becomes, "What happened to me that made this necessary?" With this shift, compassion replaces self-blame. And compassion, Miller believed, is what allows deeper truths to emerge. She wrote, "The truth about our childhood is stored up in our bodies." This idea captures something essential. Our emotional reactions are messengers. They speak on behalf of the child we once were, the one who felt overwhelmed, unseen, or responsible in ways no child should be. When we begin to listen, to treat these reactions not as inconveniences, but as signals, our relationship with ourselves changes. We stop fighting our instincts and start learning from them. A turning point often arrives during an ordinary moment. Perhaps during a conversation where you notice your voice getting smaller, and instead of forcing yourself to be confident, you pause and say, "This is the part of me that learned it wasn't safe to speak." Or in a relationship where you feel the urge to fix everything for someone else, and you gently acknowledge, "This is the caretaker I had to become." Or during an argument where your heart pounds as if you're in danger and you whisper internally, "This fear belongs to an earlier time." These subtle acts of recognition allow the adult self to step forward. They create a bridge between past and present, and while the echoes don't disappear, they soften. They lose their authority. They become understandable rather than overwhelming. This is the moment Miller wanted people to reach, not a place of accusation, but a place of clarity. Not a place of reliving the past, but of witnessing it with the strength of the present. When we understand our patterns as the emotional logic of a child doing their best, something inside us exhales. The tension between who we are and who we wish to be becomes less hostile. We begin to sense that change is possible, not through willpower, but through compassion. This turning point doesn't end the journey, but it illuminates the path ahead. It shows us that our reactions are not the enemy. They are the beginning of the conversation we've needed to have with ourselves for years. Integration is the stage where understanding begins to take root in daily life. It is not a clean, linear process. It is gentle, uneven, and deeply human. After the turning point, Miller described the moment when we finally see our patterns as echoes rather than flaws. There comes a new challenge, learning to live with that awareness. Integration isn't about eliminating old reactions. It's about building a relationship with them. It's about letting the adult self sit beside the child self, offering steadiness where there was once only instinct. This begins with slowing down. When a familiar emotional wave rises, fear, guilt, urgency, withdrawal, we learn to pause just long enough to ask the questions we once avoided. Whose fear is this? When did I first feel this way? What was I taught to believe about myself in moments like this? These questions are not meant to dredge up painful memories. They create space. They help us remember that we are not only the sum of our triggers, we are also the person witnessing them. For many people, integration means developing an inner tone that is kinder than anything they've ever used with themselves. A tone that sounds like, "Of course you're scared, you learned to be," or "Of course this feels overwhelming. You carried too much for too long." Miller believed that this inner kindness is not optional. It is the essential condition for healing childhood wounds. Without it, the child self stays frozen in time, repeating old strategies because it does not know that things have changed. What does integration look like in practice? It might look like telling someone you need time to think, even if your instinct is to immediately meet their expectations. It might look like saying no without over-explaining, even though a part of you fears disappointing them. It might look like resting without guilt for the first time in years, or allowing yourself to want something simply because it matters to you, not because it impresses anyone. Integration also means recognizing that our younger patterns will resurface, sometimes unexpectedly. You might notice yourself shrinking in a conversation, overextending in a relationship, or panicking at the idea of conflict. But instead of criticizing yourself, you meet these moments with understanding. You say, "This is the old map, but I don't have to follow it." This is how the adult self begins to lead, not by force, but by presence. Over time, choices that once felt impossible become available. You start to notice your needs without dismissing them. You begin to trust your perceptions instead of doubting them. You feel a subtle steadiness growing beneath the surface, a sense that you are becoming someone who can stay with themselves, even in discomfort. Miller believed this capacity to stay with oneself is the essence of emotional maturity. It is what allows us to live from our truth rather than our conditioning. Integration doesn't erase the past. It doesn't silence the echoes, but it changes our relationship to them. The child who learned to hide begins to feel safe enough to speak. The child who learned to please begins to feel safe enough to rest. And the child who learned to endure begins to feel safe enough to choose differently. In this way, integration is less about transformation and more about companionship. It is the adult self saying to the younger self, "I'm here now, you don't have to do this alone anymore." And slowly, beautifully, the echoes begin to harmonize with the present rather than drowning it out. As we move toward the conclusion of this reflection, it's important to return to the emotional truth that has been guiding us from the beginning. Much of what we struggle with in adulthood is rooted in needs we were never permitted to have as children. We grow older, we build lives, we take on responsibilities, but inside us, a younger self still waits for recognition. Alice Miller believed this waiting is not a weakness, it is evidence of a truth that has survived. A truth that wants to be acknowledged so it can finally rest. The beauty of this idea is that it removes the shame we often feel about our own reactions. Instead of viewing ourselves as overly sensitive, irrational, or flawed, we begin to understand our internal world as a set of emotional footprints, maybe footprints left by a child, who adapted brilliantly to circumstances they could not change. The goal is not to erase these footprints, but to recognize the journey they reveal. When we see our patterns through this lens, we stop asking ourselves to just get over it, and start asking what these echoes are trying to tell us. Miller wrote, "The repression of the truth about our childhood is what causes our suffering." This line encapsulates the heart of her work. She wasn't saying we must live in the past, quite the opposite. She was saying that unacknowledged truths quietly direct our lives until we bring them into the open. Once we name the emotional realities we endured, loneliness, pressure, invisibility, responsibility, fear, we gain the capacity to move through the world with more presence and less confusion. This understanding brings us back to the conflicts we explored at the beginning, the inexplicable reactions, the repetitive patterns, the emotional storms that seem disproportionate to the moment. With Miller's insight, those experiences no longer look mysterious. They make emotional sense. They are the voice of a younger self speaking in the only language it learned. And when the adult self listens, the dynamic begins to shift. We can see this shift in everyday life. The person who once felt trapped in people-pleasing begins to notice the first spark of self-trust. The person who avoided conflict begins to tolerate small moments of honesty. The person who constantly overextended themselves begins to experiment with rest. These changes may seem small from the outside, but internally they represent profound transformations, the early signs that the adult self is reclaiming authority over choices once made by the child. This process strengthens something essential, the ability to stand in our own experience. When we no longer fear our emotional reactions, we can approach relationships with greater honesty. We can navigate challenges without collapsing into old instincts. We can pursue paths that reflect our authentic desires rather than our conditioned roles. The echoes do not disappear, but they lose their power to determine our direction. And so by returning to the opening conflict, those moments when we feel driven by forces we cannot explain, we now see that these forces have names. They have histories. They have origins that make sense. And in understanding them, we reclaim a sense of agency that may have felt out of reach for years. The journey is not about undoing the past, but about allowing the adult self to become larger than the echoes that once dominated our inner world. This is the gift Miller wanted for every person, not perfection, but presence. Not the erasure of the child self, but the integration of its truth into a life lived with clarity and compassion. As we arrive at the final part of this reflection, it's important to recognize that every step we've taken together has been guided by a single, tender insight. You're not defined by the strategies you once used to survive. The echoes you carry are not mistakes or flaws. They are remnants of a younger self who had limited choices but extraordinary intuition. That child read the emotional landscape of your early life with remarkable precision, finding ways to stay connected, stay safe, and stay loved, often in environments that could not meet them fully. The fact that these echoes still influence your adult decisions is not a sign that you're stuck. It's a sign that you learned deeply and that your mind and body held on to what once kept you secure. In adulthood, however, we are finally given an opportunity that the child self never had, the opportunity to choose, to pause, to question, to revise, and to feel. This is the central thread that Alice Miller wove through all of her work, the possibility of reclaiming our inner world not by rejecting our past, but by approaching it with compassion. Without compassion, our echoes feel like burdens. With compassion, they become invitations to understand, to soften, and to grow. This episode has explored the ways in which early emotional patterns weave themselves into adult life, how silence becomes avoidance, how responsibility becomes overextension, how caretaking becomes exhaustion, how performance becomes perfectionism, and how fear becomes inhibition. But we have also explored the possibility of change, not through force, pressure, or the demand to be different, but through presence, through learning to sit with the parts of ourselves that once had to act quickly and quietly to protect our connection to others, through letting the adult self stand beside the child self without judgment. And so, as we close, I invite you to carry forward the most compassionate truth we've uncovered. You are not broken. You are not failing. You are not behind. You are someone who adapted intelligently to the conditions of your early life. And you are someone who now has the capacity to understand those adaptations with gentleness. When old patterns arise, as they inevitably will, you can meet them with a quiet acknowledgement. I know where this comes from. That simple recognition loosens the grip of the past more than any act of force ever could. This process does not require perfection. It does not require immediate change. It requires only honesty, patience, and a willingness to stay with yourself even when old echoes speak loudly. With time, the gap between the child who learned and the adult who is learning widens into a place of choice. And in that place, new decisions become possible decisions that reflect your current values, your present needs, and your emerging sense of self. Thank you for allowing this exploration to unfold slowly, gently, and with the tenderness this topic deserves. And thank you for walking with me into the spaces where echoes soften and new voices can begin to rise. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe for more videos like this, and thank you for watching.